The 12-year-old orphan handed Keanu Reeves a flower and whispered, "Thank you for remembering us." He thought he came to Vietnam for peace and reflection, but what he saw inside that orphanage shattered him. Why did a war fought decades ago still leave children in pain today? And what would Keanu do next that no one expected? Before we continue this incredible story, let us know where you're watching from. If you enjoy stories like this, subscribe to the channel, because tomorrow we have another inspiring story you won't want to miss. The plane touched down in Hanoi just after dawn. No entourage, no flashing cameras, no press waiting with pens in hand. Keanu Reeves stepped off the flight quietly, wearing a plain backpack and sunglasses, blending into the flow of travelers like any other man chasing peace in a place far from home. He wasn't here for a film. He wasn't here for an award. He was simply searching for silence, carrying only a weathered notebook, a pocket-sized camera, and a folded map of northern Vietnam. He declined all offers for VIP transport. Instead, he flagged down a local taxi and pointed to a village name he'd circled days earlier. No interpreter, no assistant, just a scribbled destination and the instinct to listen more than speak. The road out of Hanoi unwound like a ribbon through the hills. Keanu gazed out the window, taking in rice paddies shimmering in the morning sun, children bicycling in groups, farmers tending fields with slow rhythm. Everything moved differently here. The noise in his mind, the fast pace of Hollywood, the echo of recent grief, began to quiet with each mile. By mid-afternoon, he reached a rural district nestled between low green mountains. He checked into a modest guest house and left his things without unpacking. With camera slung around his neck, he set off down a red dirt path that curved along the fields. Villagers passed him on foot, some nodding shyly, others laughing, with children trailing behind. He didn't try to force conversation. A smile here, a gentle wave there, it was enough. At a small cafe shaded by a banyan tree, Keanu sat alone and ordered a black coffee with ice. The shopkeeper didn't recognize him, or if she did, she gave no sign. He opened his notebook and wrote only 3 words. "Here feels honest." Then, from a nearby table, he heard something unexpected. "First time back since '71, the voice said, gravelly and low. "Didn't think I'd ever come, but I guess some ghosts need seeing." Keanu turned slightly, glancing toward a man seated alone with a cup of tea and an old canvas rucksack. The man wore a faded army cap and sat with his spine too straight for someone in his 70s. His eyes were blue, but heavy, like he carried too many yesterdays. Their eyes met for a moment. Then the man gave a short nod, almost like a salute. Keanu stood, walked over quietly, and asked if he could sit. "Sure," the man said. "Name's Jack Delaney. You?" "Keanu." And just like that, the silence was shared. They sat for a while without speaking, the way strangers sometimes do when neither is in a rush to explain themselves. Jack stirred his tea with a slow, mechanical rhythm, as if it had been part of his routine for years. Keanu watched the condensation roll down his glass. There was something oddly comforting about the quiet between them. "You from around here?" Jack finally asked with a half smirk. Keanu chuckled. "Not quite. Just visiting. You?" Jack tapped the brim of his cap. "Was here a long time ago. Didn't leave the same way I came." The words sat between them, neither a confession nor a complaint. Jack didn't offer more, and Keanu didn't press. The air was warm, sweet with the smell of grilled pork drifting from a nearby stall. Children's laughter carried over from across the road, where a group played beside a parked bicycle. "What brings you back?" Keanu asked gently. Jack looked out at the fields. "To see if it's still broken, or if it ever got fixed." Keanu nodded. He understood. Maybe not the specifics, but the weight behind the words. He'd met men like Jack before. Men who had built their lives around carrying something they didn't know how to put down. "I came here for quiet," Keanu said after a pause, "and maybe to remember something I haven't found yet." Jack turned to him, really seeing him now. "You're not just some lost tourist, are you?" "No," Keanu answered simply. Jack leaned back, studying him for a moment. "You don't talk like most actors I've met." "That's probably a compliment," Keanu replied, and they both laughed, the tension easing. The cafe owner approached, with a plate of sticky rice and grilled corn, motioning for them to share. Keanu thanked her with a respectful nod, while Jack offered a quiet "come on." They ate in companionable silence, the sounds of scooters passing by like a distant breeze. When the meal was done, Jack opened his bag and pulled out an old photo, a black and white snapshot of himself in uniform, standing in front of a jungle backdrop with 3 other soldiers. The edges were frayed, the image faded. "They're all gone," Jack said, not looking at Keanu. "I never came back to bury anything, just tried to outrun it." Keanu looked at the photo and then at Jack. "Maybe it's not about burying," he said softly. "Maybe it's about seeing what's still growing." Jack didn't respond right away, but in the way his shoulders dropped, the way his jaw relaxed, it was clear something inside him had started to shift. The 2 men stood from the small table and walked slowly down the village path, the late afternoon sun painting gold across the rice fields. Neither said much, but the rhythm of their steps had already fallen into sync, as if their paths, so different and yet somehow parallel, had always meant to cross. Keanu stopped now and then to take a photo, not of anything obvious, a rusted watering can next to a blossoming hibiscus, a straw hat left hanging on a crooked fence, the reflection of a passing bike in the narrow irrigation canal. Jack noticed the way Keanu's gaze lingered on simple things. "You looking for beauty or something to make sense of it all?" Jack asked. Keanu lowered the camera and smiled quietly. "Sometimes they're the same thing." Jack grunted in a way that wasn't disagreement, just thought. "You ever been to places like this before?" "A few," Keanu said, "but never here." "Never Vietnam." They passed a man repairing fishing nets by hand, and a young girl waving from a doorway with a baby on her hip. Jack nodded respectfully to them both. "When I was last here, no one waved at me. Not like that." Keanu heard the ache in his voice. "And now?" Jack looked back over his shoulder at the girl, who had already gone back inside. "Now they do, and I don't know what to do with that." The road narrowed into a dirt lane, winding through banana trees and jackfruit. At a bend in the path, they came to a small shrine, its incense holder blackened by years of smoke, the offerings neatly arranged with new fruit and wilting flowers. Jack took off his cap. Keanu followed suit. "This isn't a tourist spot," Jack said. "This is for people who remember." They stood there for a while, not in reverence, but in reflection. The air was still except for the quiet crackle of a single incense stick. Finally, Jack turned to Keanu. "There's a place I was told about, an orphanage up north. They say it takes care of kids, ones still affected by what we did." Keanu didn't flinch. "You want to go?" Jack nodded. "I've never seen what came after, just what we left behind." Keanu looked down at his notebook, closed it, tucked it away. "Then let's see it," he said. As they walked back toward the village center, the light faded into soft lavender and orange. 2 men, one past, one present, headed toward something neither fully understood yet, but both willing to look. Jack Delaney hadn't planned to talk much. He hadn't even planned to speak at all. But something about Keanu's stillness, the way he simply listened without needing to fill the space, made it impossible to hold the weight in any longer. They sat at a quiet table tucked beneath the cafe's thatched roof, the lazy fan above them creaking slightly in the midday heat. Outside, the narrow street in Hoi An pulsed with scooters and schoolchildren. Inside, time had slowed. It was 1971, Jack said, eyes on his tea. Quang Tri Province, just 20 years old, same age as most of the boys they sent over. I didn't know anything about Vietnam. I didn't know how to say hello or I'm sorry, but I knew how to carry a rifle. Keanu nodded gently, not interrupting. His notepad remained closed. Jack rubbed his hands together, as if trying to wipe away the dirt of memory. We were stationed near a cluster of small villages, jungle on all sides. The heat was a living thing, but the people, God, the people, they weren't enemies. Most days, they just wanted to keep their heads down and raise their children. We were told to fear them. But I remember a woman who gave me water after a patrol. I remember a boy with bare feet and a tin can tied to a string, his version of a toy. And I remember giving candy to a little girl with one eye clouded over. She never said a word, just smiled. That smile, it's what stuck. Keanu leaned forward slightly, his brow furrowed in a quiet compassion that made Jack feel heard for the first time in years. I wrote her a letter, never mailed it. Jack reached into his worn messenger bag and carefully unfolded a yellowed envelope. I don't know why I kept it. Maybe I thought one day I'd come back. Maybe I owed her that. Keanu looked at the envelope, but didn't touch it. He let the silence honor it. Jack's voice cracked. But I never came back. Not until now. They sat with that truth a long moment. Finally, Jack cleared his throat. There's a place I heard about. It's an orphanage. They care for children still affected by what we left behind. Agent Orange, birth defects, families broken by poverty and ghosts. I've avoided it for decades. His voice softened. Would you come with me? Keanu nodded without hesitation. Of course. The next morning, they left early. A local driver named Hui picked them up in a modest white van, his English limited but his smile wide and warm. Jack handed him a printed map with a hand-drawn circle around a small district outside Da Nang. Neither man said much during the ride. The road narrowed as they left the main city. Rice paddies stretched out like green oceans beneath a rising sun. Water buffalo lumbered through the fields, and farmers in conical hats worked in the mud with slow, practiced ease. Occasionally, Jack would glance out the window and then look away, jaw tight. Keanu didn't speak. He simply placed a hand on Jack's shoulder once, when the older man seemed to falter. About an hour later, they pulled up to a faded iron gate with a sign that read, Trung Tam Tin Thuol, the Compassion Center. The building behind it was simple. Concrete walls, a rusted tin roof, and a painted mural of children holding flowers. It wasn't a place that had money, but it had soul. A woman in her 50s emerged from the main door, wiping her hands on an apron. Her eyes immediately found Jack. She paused, then walked forward with calm grace. "You are Mr. Delaney?" she asked in gentle, accented English. Jack stood frozen, his throat moving as he tried to form words. Keanu stepped forward. "Yes, this is Jack. I'm just a friend." She nodded. "I am Sister Lan. I was a child here. My parents were farmers in Quang Nai. My brother died from exposure. I run the home now." Jack's breath hitched, but he managed to bow slightly. "Thank you for letting us visit." Inside, the center was humble. The walls were covered in paper cutouts and drawings. Sunshine, handprints, stick figures. Children's voices echoed faintly from a rear courtyard. Sister Lan led them past two open rooms. In one, a young boy with twisted legs crawled across a mat, smiling at a girl who was painting with her toes. In another, an older child with pale, milky eyes was being gently fed by a staff volunteer. There were no cries, no pity in the air. Just a quiet rhythm of care. Jack's face turned pale as they walked. Sister Lan paused at a door. "Would you like to meet them?" Jack looked to Keanu, who simply nodded. "Yes," Jack whispered. "I think it's time." Sister Lan opened the wooden door slowly. Inside, Sunlight filtered through bamboo shutters, casting soft lines on the tiled floor. About a dozen children sat or lay on mats, some playing with blocks, others simply watching the light shift on the wall. A boy with enlarged joints struggled to reach a toy car, while a girl with severe curvature of the spine hummed softly as she rolled a painted wooden bead between her fingers. Jack took a step forward, then stopped cold. A small girl in the corner caught his eye. She couldn't have been more than 8, though her body looked frail, her spine bent unnaturally. She held a crumpled flower made of yellow tissue paper and was concentrating deeply on shaping the petals. Lan noticed and said softly, "That's Lynn. She cannot walk, but she makes flowers for all our guests." Jack knelt, tears forming before he could stop them. Lynn turned her face toward him and smiled. "Hoa," she whispered, offering the flower with both hands. "For you." Jack took it with trembling fingers. "Come on," he said, voice cracking. Keanu crouched beside him, silent. Sister Lan moved gently among the children, introducing them by name and sharing fragments of their stories. Parents who died young, grandparents too poor to care for them, some with no known family at all. She explained that while some of the children were born with their conditions, many were second or third generation victims of Agent Orange, the dioxin-heavy herbicide used during the war. "We do our best," she said, "but the world forgets. Donations are small, the needs are not." Jack stared at her. "I didn't forget. I never forgot. I just didn't know it was still happening." Sister Lan touched his arm. "It is," quietly. "Always." As they left the room, Jack paused in the hallway. His hands trembled as he pulled something from his wallet, a folded, yellowing piece of paper. "I wrote this 52 years ago," he said, handing it to Keanu. "It was for a little girl I met near our base. Gave her some candy and promised I'd come back. I never did." Keanu read the brief letter. It was childlike in tone, scrawled in young handwriting. "I don't know if she's alive. Maybe she's here, maybe she's not, but I want to read it anyway." Keanu nodded. Outside, the air smelled of clay and grass. Jack unfolded the letter with shaking hands and began to read aloud. The morning mist still clung to the hillsides as Keanu and Jack boarded a modest van headed north, their destination scribbled in Vietnamese on a paper taped to the dash. A young translator named Nhi sat beside the driver, her voice soft but steady. She had joined them at dawn, arranged by the cafe owner who'd overheard Jack's request for help navigating the countryside. Keanu sat near the window, eyes drifting across endless stretches of emerald green. Rice paddies shimmered with early light, reflecting clouds like broken mirrors. Water buffalo moved lazily through the fields, farmers guiding them with the same quiet precision passed down for generations. Jack watched too, but his expression was different, tender yet haunted. At one point, the van slowed near a crater overgrown with brush. Nhi explained it had never been filled in. Jack nodded but didn't speak. Keanu gently touched the notebook in his lap, flipping to a blank page. He began to write not just the sights, but the feeling, the stillness, the resilience, the way the land seemed to remember. As they passed a small village, Nhi suggested stopping for a short break. The group stepped out into the dust of a roadside rest area where chickens wandered freely and women sold fruit beside makeshift bamboo stands. Jack looked uneasy at first, but when a boy offered him a peeled mango with a shy grin, something shifted. A woman nearby approached, holding a woven basket. She looked directly at Jack, then spoke in Vietnamese. Nhi translated softly. She says, "Thank you for coming back, that it means something." Jack blinked fast and nodded. He tried to respond, but all he managed was a quiet, "Cam." Keanu didn't interrupt. He let the moment stretch, sacred and unforced. The past was still here, but so was forgiveness. As the van resumed its journey, they began climbing into forested hills. Along the roadside, simple stone markers stood in rows, some with dates, others with only names. Neek explained they were makeshift memorials, unofficial graves for villagers lost to both bombs and chemical residue. Some had died during the war, others long after. Keanu asked quietly, "Do people still come here?" Nee nodded. "Yes, especially on ancestor days. They bring food, flowers. Some come just to sit." The van finally turned onto a smaller path, flanked by tall trees. Jack leaned forward, recognizing the road from an old map he had once folded in his pocket. Keanu closed his notebook and placed a hand on the window, the compound now coming into view. The orphanage lay ahead. The orphanage appeared suddenly, tucked behind a curtain of towering tamarind trees and painted in sun-faded pastels. A rusted iron gate swung open as the van approached, revealing a courtyard framed by cracked concrete walkways and the gentle sway of clothes drying on lines. Keanu stepped out first, his boots crunching gravel. Jack followed slowly, his eyes locked on the peeling yellow walls like they held secrets only he could read. A group of children played under the shade of a flowering tree, their laughter soft but unmistakable. A few noticed the visitors and stopped, curious. One little boy pointed toward Keanu's camera slung around his shoulder. Another tugged on Jack's sleeve, offering a plastic toy soldier. Jack knelt to accept it, his hand shaking slightly. The boy beamed, unaware of the tears gathering in the corners of the old man's eyes. "Looks like one I carried in my pocket," Jack whispered to no one in particular. Keanu crouched beside him and gently placed a hand on Jack's shoulder. They didn't need words. The weight of the moment spoke loud enough. The orphanage director emerged from a nearby doorway. She was a woman in her late 60s, with kind eyes and a spine that had known decades of standing tall against pain. Her name was Ms. Lan. Nee introduced everyone, and after a respectful bow, Ms. Lan led them through the grounds. Inside, the halls were quiet. Fans whirred overhead. Paint peeled in corners, and the scent of medicinal balm lingered faintly in the air. Keanu's gaze drifted to the artwork on the walls. Drawings in crayon and watercolor. Trees with roots reaching hearts. Suns with tear-shaped rays. Stick figures holding hands. Smiling. Even when they had no arms or legs. They entered the first room. Beds lined the walls. Some children lay curled beneath mosquito nets, others in wheelchairs with carefully labeled footrests. Nia explained softly. Most were born after the war. But their parents or grandparents were exposed. She paused. Some will never know why. Keanu approached a girl with thick glasses and a crooked smile. She had drawn a purple flower on her bedsheet using a marker. When he asked, "Through knee, what kind it was?" she replied, "One that grows where others don't." Jack stood at the doorframe, gripping the edge with white knuckles. "I didn't think I could do this," he said quietly. Keanu looked back at him and nodded. "But you are," he replied, and together they stepped into the next room. The third room was different. It was quieter, almost still. The light filtering through the window fell gently on a row of beds, each surrounded by medical equipment. Here, the children were smaller, some barely able to lift their heads. Others curled tightly in positions their bodies had long ago surrendered to. It wasn't grief that hung in the air. It was resilience. A teenage boy named Min sat in a motorized wheelchair in the far corner, sketching something with a piece of charcoal. Keanu knelt beside him, watching as the boy's trembling hand slowly formed the outline of two men walking side by side through a grove of trees. One of them was holding a camera. The detail stunned Keanu. He glanced at Min, who smiled softly and said, "He's very observant. Doesn't talk much, but he sees everything." Min looked up at Keanu and offered the drawing. Keanu held it gently, his throat tightening. "Thank you," he whispered, though the boy couldn't hear. Min just nodded, like he understood anyway. At the center of the room, a young girl no older than 7 shuffled toward them using a metal walker. She wore a white dress with frayed sleeves and had the kind of smile that made you forget everything else. In her hand, she clutched a paper flower. Without a word, she walked up to Keanu and placed the flower in his palm. Then, in heavily accented English, she said, "Thank you for remembering us." The silence that followed was complete. Jack turned away, eyes wet. Ms. Lon gently placed a hand on his back as he steadied himself. Keanu remained still, looking at the fragile flower in his hand like it was made of glass and gravity. He looked at the girl, then knelt down to her level and said, "No, thank you." For a long time after, Keanu didn't speak. He wandered through the courtyard in silence, sitting beneath the tamarind tree where the breeze rustled leaves like whispers from a time long past. Jack joined him. They didn't need to say it. They both knew this was not just a visit. "This isn't history," Keanu finally murmured. "This is still happening." Jack nodded, his voice breaking. "And we're still part of it." The camera around Keanu's neck remained unused. His notebook, however, opened for the first time since he arrived, and he began to write. The compound gates creaked open with a slow resistance, as if the weight of history itself held them back. A canopy of trees shaded the courtyard, where a few colorful tricycles sat quietly near a faded swing set. The scent of jasmine floated gently in the humid air. Keanu followed Jack in silence, their steps uncertain. It felt less like arriving at a destination and more like stepping into a space outside of time. Inside, the walls were painted with murals, bright suns, green rice fields, and smiling stick-figure children holding hands. But as they stepped further in, the cheerful brushstrokes gave way to reality. A small boy with no legs shuffled across the floor using only his arms. A girl with clouded eyes sat humming by the window, her hands trembling as she cradled a worn cloth doll. Another child, skin taut over twisted bones, lay silently in a padded chair, eyes blinking slowly in the afternoon light. Sister Lean appeared from a side hallway, her habit a soft gray, her face lined with years of sorrow and strength. She greeted them with a gentle bow and warm eyes. "Welcome," she said softly in accented English. "They've been waiting for visitors." Jack tried to speak but couldn't. His mouth opened slightly, then closed. He looked around, his lips trembling. Keanu placed a hand on his shoulder. Sister Lean noticed and walked with them, offering no explanations at first, only space to see. "These children," she said after a moment, "were born long after the bombs stopped falling, but the chemicals remained. The pain did not leave with the soldiers." They entered a room where low beds lined the walls, each one carefully made. A child with one arm sketched birds with the other, her focus complete. Another boy was being taught to use a prosthetic leg by a caregiver who smiled with every encouraging word. "Grants like that, they never caused," Sister Lean said. "But many of them still laugh, they still dream." In the middle of the room, a girl in a wheelchair slowly approached Keanu. Her head leaned to one side, eyes bright but body frail. She held something in her lap, a crinkled paper flower folded from old wrapping paper. She reached out and whispered, "Thank you." Keanu knelt. His voice caught in his throat. Keanu reached for the paper flower gently, as if it were made of glass. His fingers brushed against hers, small and warm. The girl smiled with the kind of light that didn't need words. Jack stood behind him, swallowing hard, his eyes darting between the children and the ceiling, as if searching for a way to hold it all in. Sister Lean bent beside Keanu. "Her name is Twy," she whispered. She cannot walk, but she makes a new flower every time someone visits. She says the world remembers her when they take one." Keanu's voice was low. "How old is she?" 10, Sister Lean said. "She was born with severe bone deformities. Her mother was exposed to dioxin while pregnant from groundwater near her village." Jack stepped forward, holding his cap in both hands like a flag folded for burial. "I never knew," he murmured. "We were never told what it would do, what it would leave behind." Sister Lean nodded without blame. Many were never told, but the children feel it still. They moved on to another room where volunteers massaged stiff limbs and taught physical therapy through play. One young man with twisted legs played a Vietnamese version of chess with an older boy who was blind. A mirror hung on the wall, decorated with colored tape and stickers. It read in both Vietnamese and English, "You are not forgotten." Keanu paused before it. His own reflection stared back, eyes rimmed red, face quiet. He touched the glass gently, then lowered his hand. Jack stood beside him, silent, taking it in. A soft bell rang in the hallway. It was time for lunch. Children began wheeling themselves into the dining room or being carefully carried by aides. Despite their pain, many chatted excitedly, laughing as one boy tried to race another in mismatched wheelchairs. The smell of rice, soup, and boiled greens filled the air. Keanu and Jack sat at a small wooden table as bowls were passed around. Sister Lean brought them plates, but insisted they eat with the children. "They like to see guests share the same food," she said kindly. "It reminds them they are not separate." Jack looked at his bowl, then around the room. "I spent a year here in 71, he whispered. "Not far from this village. We dropped barrels into rivers without knowing what we were doing." He turned to Keanu. "And they're still paying the price." Keanu put down his chopsticks and watched as one of the children, a boy with only one arm and no legs, carefully fed another child beside him who couldn't lift her own spoon. Their teamwork was wordless, seamless. No one gave directions, they just understood. "These kids," Jack said, barely audible. "They're stronger than we ever were." Sister Lean returned to their table, her hands folded gently. "Do you know what hurts them most?" she asked. "It is not the pain, not even their disabilities. It is being unseen." Keanu nodded slowly. "That's why I'm here." She studied his face. "No cameras, no press, just a notebook." He offered a small smile. "It's all I need." She led them to a wall lined with photographs, black and white portraits of children now grown, some gone. Beneath each was a name, a date of birth, and in many cases, a date of death. She stopped in front of one. This boy was Mintz. He had leukemia linked to exposure. But he loved drawing. That's his art on the wall over there. A watercolor sketch, simple, beautiful, showed a bright yellow sun rising over a rice field with a stick figure boy and a dog standing beside it. Jack reached out and touched the glass frame. "That could have been the kid I gave candy to," he said. "I've always wondered. Maybe he got sick. Maybe that was him." Keanu placed a hand on his shoulder, steadying the weight Jack seemed to carry in his chest. Neither spoke. They didn't have to. Suddenly, a small voice broke through the quiet. "You come back?" It was Twee again, wheeling herself beside Keanu with determination in her eyes. She held out another paper flower. This one, red. Keanu leaned down. "Yes, I'll come back." She beamed, then placed the flower in his breast pocket with ceremonial care. "Then I remember you." Jack turned away, his hands trembling. Keanu reached into his notebook and scribbled a sentence. Then he looked around the orphanage. At the crooked walls, the humble beds, the medical charts held together with tape. "Then were never part of the war," he said aloud, echoing Sister Leanne's earlier words. "But they carry it." For a long moment, there was only the soft sound of children's laughter behind them. Then Keanu added one more sentence to his page. This isn't history, it's still happening. Keanu knelt beside the little girl, his knees touching the cool tiled floor. The paper flower she had handed him trembled slightly in his grip, not because of its fragility, but because of his. The girl looked up at him with eyes that radiated more peace than a child living in pain should know. Her legs were thin and bent inward, her feet strapped gently into a soft brace attached to her wheelchair. She smiled again, this time adding in a slow, careful Vietnamese, "My name is Ha. My..." Sister Lean stepped closer and translated softly, though Keanu had already understood the tone. "She made that flower for today," the sister said. "She told me last week, someone kind is coming. I want to give them something that lasts." Keanu looked at Hamai and nodded. "You've given me more than you know." She giggled and tilted her head. Keanu touched his chest. "Keanu?" She repeated it in a whisper, then carefully turned her chair to roll away toward the others, leaving Keanu stunned. Jack, who had been standing a few feet away, wiped at his eyes. He had barely spoken since they entered the orphanage, but now his voice cracked. "He's like the girl I wrote to," he murmured. Keanu stood, still holding the flower. "Did you give her that letter?" he asked. Jack shook his head. "No, I kept it. I didn't think it'd matter by now." Sister Lean stepped closer. "You'd be surprised how much they remember, even what they never saw." Keanu turned to her, voice quiet. "Do they still come? New children?" Her face turned grave. "Yes. Every year. Some are born with missing limbs, some with hearts that need surgery before they turn 5. Their parents were exposed, sometimes even their grandparents." Jack paled. "We thought it faded with time. We thought..." Keanu's voice interrupted him, not sharp, but heavy. "This isn't history. This is still happening." He looked around the courtyard, the chipped toys, the row of tiny sandals at the nursery door, the medical van with rust curling around the bumper. "I need to see the medical wing," he said. Sister Lee nodded. "I'll take you there." The hallway leading to the medical wing was dim and narrow, lit only by strips of flickering fluorescent bulbs and the gentle light of the afternoon sun filtering through barred windows. Keanu walked slowly, absorbing everything: the faint antiseptic smell, the peeling posters on nutrition, the gentle clatter of a nurse moving supplies on a tray. Jack followed a few steps behind, his boots suddenly feeling heavier than they had in years. They passed a row of photographs taped along the corridor wall. Children with smiling faces, some in wheelchairs, others missing fingers, some with bright eyes behind oxygen masks. Each one had a name written underneath. Some had red dots beside them. Keanu stopped in front of a photo of a boy, no older than 10, with a tube running beneath his nose and an IV taped to his thin arm. His name, Duke. Red dot. Sister Lean saw his eyes narrow. "He passed away last month," she said softly. "Heart failure, complications from an unclosed ventricular defect, common in Agent Orange exposure cases." Keanu said nothing. He just stared at the picture for a moment longer, then continued down the hallway. They entered a small room with 3 beds and an old ultrasound machine pushed into the corner. A young boy lay curled on one cot, his skin pale, chest rising in shallow bursts. A nurse adjusted his blanket gently, then nodded in quiet greeting as Keanu stepped forward. "Has spina bifida," the nurse said. "His mother was exposed to dioxin through ground contamination in their village." Jack leaned against the doorframe. "We didn't know," he whispered. "Back then, we didn't know what it would do." Keanu turned slowly toward him. "But now we do, and it's still happening." He stepped closer to the boy, careful not to startle him. The boy blinked slowly, then offered a weak smile. Keanu reached into his pocket, pulling out the paper flower Hamai had given him. He placed it gently on the edge of the boy's blanket. A tear slipped down the boy's cheek. The nurse, voice trembling, said, "He hasn't smiled in 3 days." Jack closed his eyes, breathing unevenly. Keanu turned to Sister Lean. "How many more children are here?" 48 in this facility, another 20 in the outreach program, all needing daily care. Keanu's jaw tensed. "How do you do it?" he asked. She met his eyes calmly. "We can't undo the past, but we can stand in front of it and protect what's still here." Keanu followed Sister Leanne into a quieter wing of the center. This part was less clinical, more like a sanctuary. Woven mats covered the floor. Walls were painted with faded murals of flowers and children holding kites. In the center of the room, a group of older children sat in a semicircle, some in wheelchairs, others lying on cushions, all watching a young volunteer read aloud from a picture book. Her voice was gentle, her Vietnamese melodic. Can't all follow the words," Sister Leanne explained, "but they feel the story, they feel the voice." Jack stood silently beside Keanu. He watched one girl, her hands curled inward, eyes unable to focus, but a tiny smile had formed on her face, the kind that came not from comprehension, but from feeling seen. "These are the ones people forget exist," Sister Leanne added. "They're not on posters, they won't recover, but they're still here, and they still matter." Keanu knelt again, resting a hand lightly on the corner of one child's mat. The child turned her head slowly toward him, eyes tracking his hand, then his face. There was no fear, just curiosity. Keanu reached into his jacket and pulled out his notebook. He opened to a blank page and began sketching. Soft lines. A tree in the wind. A kite above it. He passed the page to the child. She touched it lightly, then let her hand rest on the drawing as if it were warm. Jack's voice broke the moment. "I fought in this country. I hurt people here. I left thinking that was the end of it. But this is the war still breathing." Keanu looked at him, eyes steady. "You're here now, that counts." Jack swallowed hard. "I never expected forgiveness." "You're not asking for it," Keanu replied quietly. "You're offering something else. Presence. That's enough for today." As they stood to leave, Sister Leanne placed her hand on Keanu's arm. "There is one more room," she said. "It's small, but important." They followed her down a narrow hallway, past a room filled with oxygen tanks and feeding supplies, and into a modest space lit only by a window. Inside stood a filing cabinet. On top of it sat rows of unclaimed photographs, images of children whose families never came back, children lost to illness, poverty, or the past itself. They were never officially listed as casualties, Sister Leanne said, but they were the war's final echoes. Keanu stood frozen. He looked at Jack. "I thought I came to learn," he whispered, "but I came to witness." Jack nodded, tears in his eyes. "And we're not finished yet." The hallway was dim, quiet except for the soft tap of Keanu's shoes against the tile. A breeze stirred the edge of a faded curtain, and the scent of antiseptic mixed with something faintly floral, perhaps incense from an earlier prayer. He followed Sister Leanne without speaking. Jack had slowed his steps behind them, as if each footfall weighed heavier the deeper they went into the facility. Then the hallway turned. Keanu stopped in place. Before him, covering both sides of the corridor wall, were photographs. Hundreds, maybe more, framed in plain, identical wood. Some had names underneath, typed neatly on strips of yellowing paper. Others bore hand-drawn lettering, faint marks made by a child or perhaps a volunteer with limited resources. Beneath many photos were dates. Most began in the 1990s. A few, heartbreakingly, ended in infancy. "This," Sister Leanne said gently, "is the memory hall." Keanu's eyes moved from one photo to the next. A boy with soft curls and bright eyes. A girl, maybe 4, missing both hands but smiling. An infant wrapped in a donated American Red Cross blanket. "They are all children who passed away here," she explained. "Since the early 90s. Most were born long after the war ended, but their bodies tell the truth. Time tries to forget. Jack stopped a few feet away. His hand grazed the edge of the wall, but he didn't look up. His head had bowed, his shoulders heavy. For a moment, it looked like he'd aged 10 years just standing there. Keanu stepped forward. He read names, quietly. Lin, Bao, Mai, Thien. Each name seemed too short for the story behind it. Each child too small for the burden they carried. He reached a section where the photos were arranged tighter together. Sister Lin's expression shifted. Her voice softened. These are the unclaimed. Keanu turned. The wall ahead was different. The photos here had no names, no birthdays, no information at all. Just tiny faces, most of them infants. Some were wrapped in worn hospital sheets, others appeared to be just hours old. They stared back at him with eyes that had never known comfort or family. His children had no known relatives, she said. Some were left at our gate. Others were born to mothers too sick to stay. We try to give them dignity in death, at least a photograph. A place to belong. Keanu's breath caught. He reached out and touched the edge of one frame. A newborn girl, her head slightly tilted, mouth open in mid-sigh. The photo was faded, the wood frame chipped. He whispered, "She was beautiful." Sister Lin didn't answer. She didn't need to. Keanu kept staring. Time didn't move. Then, just behind him, Jack's footsteps turned away. A shuffle, a pause. And then he walked back the way they came. Not in anger, not in shame. Just in quiet grief. But Keanu stayed. His eyes locked on one image. A baby boy. No name. No story. Just a photo and a space on the wall that the world had once refused to see. Keanu stood silently in front of the photo of the nameless baby boy. His eyes traced the soft curve of the child's cheek, the fragile outline of his ear, the barely visible fuzz of hair along his scalp. The image was worn, its corners curling, as if time itself had tried to erase him. But the face remained. Still, solemn, impossibly small. "How many more are there like him?" Keanu asked quietly. Sister Lin took a slow breath before answering. "There is no count. Not truly. The records from the early years are scattered. We know of nearly 800 children who passed through this center since it opened in 1991. Some made it to adulthood, most did not." Keanu's hand gently brushed the wooden edge of the frame. "And the unclaimed?" 83. Her voice wavered for the first time. 83 little ones who left the world with no name, no history, and no one to mourn them. Except us. Keanu turned to her. "You remember them all?" Sister Lin nodded. "We try. Every year on the anniversary of their passing, we light a candle for each one. We recite a blessing. And we place flowers under their pictures. It's all we can do." There was a heavy silence between them. Then Keanu spoke, almost to himself. "I've read about Agent Orange. I've seen the statistics. But this isn't statistics. This is a wall full of children who never got a single chance." Sister Lin's eyes glistened. "People think war ends when the soldiers go home. But for us, for these children, it never ended." Keanu looked back at the baby boy. He should have had a name, a crib, a mother to hold him. Did have a mother," she said softly. "She was a local farm worker. She died giving birth. Her lungs collapsed. Fibrosis from chemical exposure in the fields." Keanu's jaw clenched, not in anger, but in helplessness. "I'd like to give him a name," he said suddenly. Sister Lin's eyebrows lifted. "What would you call him?" Keanu stared into the photo for a long time. Then he said, "Hope." The nun nodded slowly. then that is who he will be. She took out a small strip of paper, knelt beside the wall, and wrote the name with careful strokes. Hope. She slid the label beneath the photograph. For the first time in decades, that space on the wall no longer stood in silence. Keanu stepped back, eyes glistening, and whispered again, "You're not forgotten." Keanu remained still after the label was placed. The word hope under that photo now echoed louder than any speech he could have given. He didn't reach for his phone. He didn't take a picture. He simply stood there, breathing in the silence, letting the weight of it settle deep into his chest. Behind him, footsteps approached. Jack had returned, his eyes red-rimmed, his demeanor steadier than before. "I needed air," Jack murmured, voice rough. Keanu glanced at him. "I get it." Jack looked at the wall, and when he saw the new name beneath the photograph, he stopped cold. "Hope?" Keanu nodded. He didn't have a name. He deserved one. Jack took a long breath. "My buddy, back in '72, we used to joke that if we ever made it out, we'd name our kids after the things we never thought we'd see again. Peace, kindness, hope." He stepped closer and rested his hand gently against the wall beside the photo. "I never had kids," Jack whispered. "But maybe this counts." Sister Lean returned, holding a box of dried lotus flowers. "We give one to every visitor who remembers a child's name," she said quietly. She handed one to Jack and then to Keanu. The flower in Keanu's hand was delicate and brittle, like paper. But in that moment, it felt like stone, something permanent. He tucked it gently into the inside pocket of his jacket. A group of children passed through the hallway, some walking, some being pushed in wheelchairs. They giggled as they moved, laughing over something that had nothing to do with war or history. One of them waved to Keanu. Another paused and tapped the wall, pointing to a photograph above her own head. "That's my sister," she said in Vietnamese. The translator relayed her words. "She's sleeping in the sky now." Keanu's voice caught. He knelt and placed a hand over his heart. "Am on," he said softly. "Thank you." The little girl smiled and ran to catch up with the others. Sister Lean watched them disappear down the corridor. "We try to make this place feel like home, even when it was never supposed to exist." Keanu looked at her. No one should grow up in the aftermath of something they never caused. The hallway grew quiet again. Then Sister Liane, almost inaudibly, said, "That's why we remember." Keanu looked back at the wall of names, hundreds of them, and one more now. Lunch was served on a long row of wooden tables beneath an open-air veranda, shaded by corrugated tin and vines curling overhead. The children at the orphanage didn't wait for ceremony. Some rushed forward with small bowls, while others waited patiently in wheelchairs as caregivers ladled rice and broth. The scent of lemongrass, ginger, and slow-simmered vegetables floated in the air, earthy and warm. Keanu took a seat beside a boy whose right hand trembled every time he tried to grip the spoon. The boy's eyes darted between the bowl and his fingers, a small frown forming on his lips. Without a word, Keanu reached over gently and steadied the bowl, guiding the spoon with a calm, steady touch. The boy looked up, surprised, but then smiled. It was wide and toothy, and it made Keanu's chest ache. They continued like that, bite after bite, two strangers sharing something deeper than words. At the far end of the table, Jack sat beside Mai, her tiny frame wrapped in a soft scarf one of the nuns had tied around her shoulders earlier. He pulled something from his pocket, a thin silver bracelet etched with 3 names. He explained quietly that it had belonged to his wife, who had passed years ago. "She always said I'd know when to give this to someone," he whispered, voice hoarse. Mai blinked slowly, then reached out with her small hand. She didn't speak. She didn't have to. Jack slipped the bracelet around her wrist, fastened it, and patted her hand. Then he placed his weathered palm over his heart. Keanu heard wind stirring the trees behind them. He reached for the small recorder in his side bag, pressed play. The device hummed to life, capturing the layered beauty of the moment. The clink of spoons on bowls, soft laughter, a rustling breeze, and footsteps in the distance. He didn't want to forget this. Not the sound, not the peace. A young girl with cropped hair and a bright yellow shirt handed Keanu a folded paper envelope. She didn't say a word, just bowed her head respectfully and walked away. Sister Lean approached soon after, nodding toward the letter. "She wrote it last week," she explained. "It's for someone she didn't know yet. She said she would know when to give it." Keanu turned the envelope in his hands, hesitant to open it too quickly. Something in him already knew. This letter would stay with him forever. Keanu waited until he was alone under a canopy of trees behind the orphanage before opening the letter. The paper was thin, slightly crumpled, and written in careful block letters with a purple crayon. The English was broken, but the meaning was clear. "Dear someone, if you are reading this, maybe you came far to see us. Thank you. Sometimes I wonder if the world remembers we are here. I don't have a papa or a mama, but I have trees, sisters, and wind. If you tell others we exist, maybe that is like love. Don't forget us. Love, Lynn, age 14. Keanu folded the letter back with trembling fingers. He pressed it to his chest, closing his eyes. Lynn didn't know his name, didn't know he was famous. She had simply written from her heart to a stranger she hoped would carry her voice beyond the hills. Back at the veranda, the meal had ended. Children rested in hammocks or played quietly in shaded corners. Jack sat with his head tilted back, eyes closed, letting the soft chatter wash over him like a balm. For the first time, he wasn't haunted. He was present. Sister Lean knelt beside a boy whose legs were wrapped in cloth. She was helping him build a tower from wooden blocks. She looked up at Keanu. "People come and go," she said. "But when someone truly sees us, the children remember, even if they never come back." Keanu crouched beside her and asked, "How long have you been here?" "Since I was 15. My parents were farmers. After the war, I came to help the sisters, never left. I married this place." She smiled, eyes misty. "The world moved on, but these children stayed in its shadow." Jack joined them quietly, lowering himself to the dirt beside the boy with the tower. "I used to believe the past stayed behind," he said, "but I was wrong. Sometimes it waits for you to catch up." Keanu reached for a second block and handed it to the boy, who placed it on top with a quiet grunt of concentration. The tower leaned, wobbled, and then held. Wind swept through the trees again. Sister Lean looked up at the rustling leaves. "It's been a good day," she whispered. Jack nodded. "The best I've had in 50 years. Keanu looked down at the letter from Lynn, folded neatly in his shirt pocket. He didn't say a word, but inside, something sacred had shifted. This wasn't a visit anymore. This was a vow. Later that afternoon, the sun began its slow descent behind the trees, casting long golden streaks across the dirt courtyard. The children were gathered beneath the shade, sitting cross-legged as Sister Lean read a Vietnamese folktale from memory. Her voice was soft and melodic, wrapping around them like a lullaby. Keanu and Jack sat on a nearby bench, sipping cooled tea. Neither spoke for a while. The moment didn't need words. Eventually, Keanu pulled out his small notebook, flipping past pages of hotel addresses, film notes, and blank space until he reached a clean page. He began sketching a rough outline, not of a scene or a script, but of the courtyard, the tree canopy, the uneven smiles, and the crayon-written letter that still lingered in his thoughts. Jack watched quietly. "You're not just remembering this, are you?" Keanu looked up, then shook his head. "No, I'm trying to carry it." Jack tapped his chest gently. "That's where it needs to stay." A loud clang interrupted them. Lynn had dropped a metal pan while helping clean up. A younger child rushed to help her, and the two broke into laughter after the noise. Keanu smiled, lowering his pen. "There's something holy about this place," he said. "And it's not the silence, it's the resilience." Jack leaned forward. "You know, I used to think I was coming back to make peace with what I did. But I think I'm here to witness what survived despite it." The light shifted again as a breeze swept in, bringing with it the scent of jasmine and warm earth. In that fragile stillness, Ha Mai rolled her chair toward them, holding something small in her lap. A flower folded from a torn piece of newspaper. She looked at Keanu and handed it to him without a word. He took it gently and nodded in gratitude. "Thank you." She smiled, wide and proud. "You're kind, like Grandpa Jack." Jack chuckled softly, clearly moved. "Now there's a compliment I never thought I'd earn." Keanu tucked the paper flower into the pages of his notebook like a pressed orchid. Ha Mai wheeled away, content, her tiny hands waving at the older girls perched along the stairs. Sister Lean's story ended, and applause erupted. Not loud, but full of life. As dusk painted the sky above them, Keanu leaned back and exhaled slowly. Peace had a sound, and here it was made of children's voices, cracked laughter, and the rustle of leaves over forgotten pain. Night had fallen gently over the orphanage. Outside the window, the trees rustled softly, stirred by a breeze that carried the scent of earth and rain. The lights in the compound had dimmed, and silence had taken over. Except for the faint whispers of children talking in their sleep and the distant hum of a ceiling fan. Keanu sat alone on a cot in the guest room, a small lamp casting a warm, low glow over the simple desk in front of him. In his hands, slightly trembling, was the envelope Sister Leon had handed him that afternoon. It was made from recycled paper, its edges worn, its ink faded in places, but the handwriting was careful, deliberate. Someone had taken great time to write what was inside. He unfolded the letter gently, afraid the fragile paper might tear. The first line hit him like a wave. "Dear American visitor, thank you for coming. Please tell the world we are still here. Please tell them our pain does not end just because the war did." Keanu's throat tightened. The letter continued, written by an older child, 16, maybe 17, whose English was halting but deeply heartfelt. "Sometimes, people come and take photos. They smile. We smile too. Then they leave, and the photos disappear. But we stay, with the pain, with the silence. You didn't bring cameras. You looked at us. That means something." Keanu pressed his hand to his chest, as if trying to still the ache. His eyes moved slowly across each sentence. The room seemed to grow smaller with every word. "I have a dream to study music, but my hands do not always listen. I was born like this. They say it's not my fault, but I still feel it sometimes, like a shadow." There was a pause, a skipped line, and then, "If you go back to your country, please don't forget us. Please say our names if you can. Please remember that we are not broken, just left behind." Keanu folded the letter shut slowly, carefully, as if it were something sacred. He didn't want to cry, but he did. He reached for the journal lying beside his bag and opened it to the page where Ha Mai's tiny paper flower had been gently pressed. It still held its shape. Its creases were soft, but firm, like the hands that had made it. He stared at it for a long time, the silence wrapping around him like a quilt he didn't ask for, and he knew he wouldn't sleep that night. Keanu remained at the desk long after midnight, his eyes returning again and again to the folded letter. The weight of the words inside settled over him like a fog, quiet, slow, unshakable. He had traveled to Vietnam to find solitude. Instead, he had found stories that had never been told, stories that had waited decades to be heard. He opened his journal and began to write, slowly, thoughtfully. "They don't ask for pity," he wrote. "They ask for memory, for presence, for someone to look at them and not turn away." His pen moved carefully, as if he was afraid to get it wrong. He wasn't writing as an actor or a public figure. He was writing as a man who had been changed. The letter had cracked something in him wide open. He thought of Hamai's tiny voice saying thank you as she held out that paper flower, the way Jack had looked at the wall of names, the way Sister Lean had said, "These children were never part of the war, but they carry it." He wrote her name again, Hamai. Then he wrote, "How many more are still waiting to be seen?" There was a soft knock on the door. Jack stepped in, his face shadowed by the hall light. "You awake?" Keanu nodded. Jack walked in quietly, holding 2 small cups of instant coffee. "Didn't think I'd sleep either," the older man said, settling into the wooden chair across from him. "Some things just don't let you close your eyes." He set the coffee down between them. Keanu didn't say anything at first. He just passed the letter across the table. Jack unfolded it and began to read. A few lines in, his jaw clenched. "That's right," Jack said softly. "We thought the war ended, that the damage would fade with time. But it didn't. It just moved into new faces." Keanu looked at him. "You said something earlier about carrying things home without knowing it. Maybe this is what you were meant to carry back." Jack nodded. "Maybe it is." There was silence again. Not awkward, just heavy, grieving. Keanu stared down at the pressed flower in his journal. "They've lost so much, but they still smile." "Yeah," Jack whispered. "And we've got everything, and sometimes we still don't." Keanu looked out the window, where the faint outline of the trees swayed in the dark. "Tomorrow, I want to visit the medical wing again. And then, I want to ask Sister Lean what they need, really need." Jack gave a tired smile. "Good, let's start there." The morning came gray and slow, filtered through thin curtains and rooster calls from somewhere beyond the courtyard. Keanu had not slept. The flower from Hamai remained pressed in his journal, and the letter was folded gently in his shirt pocket. He watched the sky shift from deep blue to a lighter hue, feeling the weight of the letter settle deeper into his chest. At breakfast, the children were already up, some sweeping the courtyard with tiny brooms, others helping prepare rice and eggs under Sister Leanne's watchful guidance. Jack stood near a wooden bench, sipping tea, and watching with an expression that flickered between admiration and quiet regret. Sister Lean approached them both, her face kind, but sharp-eyed. "You read the letter?" she said softly. Keanu nodded. Sister Lean explained. "She never puts her name, just a child of the war, but each word is real. None of them ask for fame, just for someone to remember that they are still here." Keanu folded his hands and looked at her. "What do you need most?" The nun hesitated, then spoke plainly. "Basic things. Wheelchairs, breathing machines, medicine for seizures. Not everything can be donated, and many centers like ours don't have any foreign aid anymore." Jack cleared his throat. "Why?" "Because attention moved on," she replied gently. "The headlines changed, but the suffering stayed." Keanu looked down, then met her eyes. "I want to help. Not just here. Everywhere. This is still happening." Sister Lean smiled, though her eyes shimmered. "Even one voice can reach far, if it's honest." Later, Keanu walked the grounds again, this time with his camera. But he didn't take portraits. He captured textures, the peeling paint on the wall of names, the curve of Ha Mai's wheelchair handle, the worn sandals beside a cot, a photo of Jack's hand resting on the edge of a windowsill, the light catching the silver in his wedding ring. He wasn't trying to document tragedy. He was trying to hold on to truth. When they said their goodbyes for the day, Ha Mai wheeled up to him again. This time, she didn't speak. She just reached for his hand, placed it gently over her own heart, and smiled. Keanu knelt, swallowing the ache rising in his throat. "I'll remember," he whispered. As the sun lifted higher, Keanu Reeves left the orphanage in silence. But inside him, something louder than any war had already begun to grow. The next morning, the sun filtered gently through the slatted windows of the guest quarters, warming the tiled floors and casting soft lines across Keanu's open journal. He had not written a word since the night before. The letter still rested beside him, edges curled, the ink slightly smudged where his hand had gripped it too tightly. He hadn't slept much. The silence in this place wasn't empty, it was thick, filled with the sounds of history still breathing. He stood and slipped the journal into his backpack, along with a carefully pressed paper flower from Hey Mai. The weight of it felt different now, not just sentimental. Outside, the compound had already come alive. Young volunteers were setting out plastic chairs for morning activities, and an older nurse in a pale blue smock was walking with a child who leaned heavily on a wooden cane. Keanu watched for a moment before stepping into the corridor. He didn't speak. He just walked. As he passed the main courtyard, he noticed Jack sitting alone on a bench beneath a tamarind tree. His hat was off, resting beside him. His hands were folded in his lap. He looked like a man deep in thought, not haunted, but holding something too large to explain. Keanu didn't approach him yet. Instead, he wandered toward the edge of the center's grounds, where a small community garden flourished beside the fence. Rows of morning glory vines, green herbs, and even a few papaya trees bent under the weight of their fruit. A teenage boy with one prosthetic arm was watering the plants with quiet focus. A young Vietnamese woman, likely in her 20s, stepped out from the adjacent classroom building. She smiled at Keanu and offered him a gentle wave. "Good morning," she said in English. Her accent was soft, her eyes alert. "Morning," Keanu replied. "You volunteer here?" "Yes. I was born nearby. I come after school. Most of us do." She glanced toward the children playing hopscotch along a chalk-drawn grid. One of them, a girl, with braces on both legs, had just stumbled and fallen. Two others rushed to help her up, and soon they were laughing again. "How do you fund all this?" Keanu asked. "Donations. Mostly from visitors. A few international sponsors. We do our best, but it's hard." Keanu nodded slowly. He already knew the answer, but hearing it still sank in deep. Then he turned, finally, and walked toward Jack. Jack didn't look up as Keanu sat beside him on the weathered bench. For a while, neither of them said anything. The tamarind branches swayed overhead, casting rippling shadows on the ground. "I used to hate this silence," Jack said finally, his voice low. "Back in the day, it meant something was coming." Keanu glanced at him, waiting. "But here," Jack exhaled slowly, "now it feels like the only honest thing I have left." Keanu nodded. "It's peaceful." Jack gave a short laugh. "You say that now, but when I first came here in '71, it didn't look anything like this. No laughter, no flowers, just mud, fear, and confusion. Kids ran barefoot through minefields without knowing it. Villagers vanished overnight." He paused, pulling a worn envelope from his pocket, the same one he'd shown Keanu before. It was folded a dozen times over. "I never mailed it," Jack said. "Not because I was afraid, but because I didn't think anyone cared." Keanu looked out at the courtyard. Ha-Mai was tracing shapes in the dirt with her fingers. A boy with no arms was laughing as another child tickled him with a feather. "They'd be care," Keanu said. "They just don't always have a voice." Jack stared at the letter for a long moment, then tucked it back into his pocket. "I've lived a long time, Keanu. Seen a lot of things I wish I hadn't. But what breaks me isn't what I did during the war. It's what I didn't do after it." Keanu looked at him with quiet understanding. "What would you have done differently?" Jack didn't answer right away. His eyes scanned the horizon, the trees, the crumbling cement walls, patched over with bright murals drawn by children. "I would have come back," Jack finally said. "I would have found out who lived, who suffered, who grew up with our shadows. We left a mess here and we just walked away. I told myself I was following orders, that it wasn't my fight anymore. But when you see these kids..." He wiped his eyes roughly. Keanu leaned forward, elbows on his knees. "Would you do it again? Come back, I mean." Jack's eyes met his, clearer than before. "If I had known what I left behind, I would have never left." For a moment the wind paused. Even the birds seemed to hold their breath. Keanu reached into his pack and pulled out his camera. "Then maybe we start now." Keanu followed Jack as he rose slowly from the bench, both men now walking in quiet sync toward the open courtyard. Children were scattered across the space like blossoms, some drawing with chalk, others napping on mats. The air smelled faintly of jasmine and earth. A young nurse knelt nearby, helping a boy adjust his leg braces. Her hands were gentle, her eyes kind. Keanu watched everything. Every gesture, every unfinished sentence between caregivers and children. He began to take photos, not as a celebrity, not even as an artist, but as a man trying to remember. He took them slowly, reverently, with the quiet weight of someone documenting truth. One image caught his breath. A girl, no more than 7, missing one hand, was braiding another child's hair. Her movements were clumsy but patient. The other child closed their eyes, completely at ease. "This," Keanu whispered, "is strength." Jack was a few paces ahead, speaking to Sister Lean near a shaded wall. She had brought out a wooden box, old and cracked, its edges wrapped in string. Inside were letters, photos, and trinkets left behind by children over the years. Jack knelt beside her as she opened it. "These are things no one came back for," she said softly. Keanu stepped closer and knelt too. The box smelled like mildew and memory. Inside were folded paper cranes, snapshots faded by time, and small notes scribbled in Vietnamese and English. A button from a soldier's jacket, a broken toy plane. Jack picked up one photo, a baby in a pink blanket, her eyes wide and startled. On the back, someone had written a date, March 2, 1999. No name. "Where do you keep these?" Keanu asked. Sister Lean looked at him, her voice barely above a whisper. "Because someone has to remember them. And because one day, someone might come looking." Jack's hand trembled as he placed the photo back into the box. "I hope they do," he said. A bell rang from the main hall. The afternoon program was beginning, music and light therapy. Volunteers guided the children inside. The courtyard began to empty, but Keanu remained still. He turned to Jack. "We can't walk away from this." Jack nodded. "We won't." Keanu stood, eyes resting on the mural painted along the wall. A tree with handprint leaves. Underneath it, in both Vietnamese and English, the words were painted. "We are still here." Keanu took one final photo, not with his camera, but with his heart. The morning of their departure came with a stillness that felt heavier than the fog rolling off the distant hills. Keanu stood by the van, hands tucked into the pockets of his lightweight jacket, watching the courtyard slowly fill with tiny footsteps and soft voices. The children had gathered, one by one, to say goodbye. No one told them to. They just came. Kamai rolled forward in her chair, a new paper flower in her lap. She had folded it that morning, with trembling fingers and fierce determination. Keanu knelt as she held it out to him, her eyes wide and unwavering. "You remember?" she asked softly. Keanu took the flower like it was glass. "I do." Around them, laughter fluttered in waves. One of the boys ran up and tugged gently on Jack's sleeve, then handed him a small wooden airplane made from popsicle sticks. Jack took it like a soldier being handed a medal. His eyes misted. Sister Lean stepped forward next. Her palms closed over Keanu's with quiet grace. In them, she placed a single, polished wooden bead. "For your pocket," she said, "to remind you that silence is not absence." Keanu closed his fingers around it slowly, the way a person clutches a memory they aren't ready to let go of. "I don't know how to say thank you," he murmured. "You just did." She smiled, eyes kind and unburdened by the years she had spent watching children die before their time. As they moved toward the van, children waved and signed goodbye in gestures they'd made up over time. Fingers fluttering near hearts, palms pressed to cheeks, hands shaped like birds in flight. Keanu paused at the door and turned back one last time. He didn't wave, he just nodded. A deep, quiet bow of the head. The drive away was long and slow, not because of the roads, but because of the silence that settled between the two men. Jack stared out the window, sunglasses hiding most of his thoughts. Keanu kept glancing at the flower in his hand until he gently tucked it into his notebook beside the first one. An hour into the ride, Keanu asked the driver to pull over. The car came to a gentle stop by a grove of eucalyptus trees. Keanu stepped out, took a long breath, then leaned against the hood, arms crossed. Jack joined him without a word. Then Keanu finally said, "I can't leave this the way it is." Jack looked over, his jaw tightening, as if the weight of everything they'd seen was just now settling into his bones. "What do you mean?" he asked, though a part of him already knew. Keanu didn't answer right away. He watched the wind ripple through the tall grass, watched how the leaves danced like small green flags whispering across the silence. He pulled the wooden bead from his pocket, turned it in his fingers. "I mean," Keanu said quietly, "I can't just go back to LA, go back to sets and lights and headlines, knowing what we saw, knowing what's still happening." Jack exhaled, slow and steady. "I've tried for years to forget. But this trip, those kids, they didn't let me." Keanu nodded. They shouldn't. There was a long pause between them, not uncomfortable, but full, like the air had thickened with truth. "I want to help," Keanu said, "but not the way people expect. Not with my name stamped all over a gala or a press release." Jack raised an eyebrow. "So how then?" Keanu's voice dropped. Quietly, effectively. He pulled out a folded piece of paper from his journal. It had rough sketches, handwritten ideas. At the top, a title, Silent Roots Foundation. "I want to start something that grows without needing the spotlight," he continued. "A fund, maybe even a clinic down the line. Not just money, but supplies, transport, long-term support for the orphanages and the doctors doing the work." Jack took the paper and stared at it. "You already thought this through?" "I started writing it last night after the letter," Keanu said. "I couldn't sleep." Jack looked up from the page. "And you don't want your name on it?" Keanu shook his head. "If they see me, they won't see them. I want the story to be about the kids. The unclaimed. Sisterline." Jack nodded slowly. Then he folded the paper, handed it back, and rested a hand on Keanu's shoulder. "You've got my help," he said. "Whatever you need, whatever it takes." Keanu met his eyes, grateful. "Thank you." Jack smiled faintly. "You know," he added, "for a guy who came here to disappear, you sure know how to show up." They shared a small, quiet laugh, the first since they'd left the center. Then Keanu whispered, "It's not over. It can't be." The car pulled back onto the road, tires crunching the gravel as they made their way toward Da Nang. The countryside slowly unfurled around them, fields giving way to hills, hills giving way to scattered villages, draped in early afternoon haze. But Keanu's thoughts remained behind, in that compound surrounded by trees and soft children's voices. He sat with his notebook open on his lap. The flower Hamai had given him was now pressed between two pages, its red edges curling like flame. His pen hovered, then moved with clarity. "This isn't about the past," he wrote. "This is about the shadow the past still casts. The children carry it. The silence carries it. And now, I carry it too." He stopped writing, stared out the window. Jack had fallen quiet beside him, arms folded, his face turned toward the light. There was something softer about him now, less guarded, a man who had come full circle, not in shame, but in reconciliation. As they neared the edge of town, Keanu spoke again. "I want to sell the Vincent Black Shadow." Jack looked at him sharply. "The bike?" Keanu nodded. "One of my favorites. It's rare. Collectors will fight over it. That thing's worth a fortune." Keanu looked down at the pressed flower in his notebook. "So are they." Jack was quiet for a moment, then smiled. "You're serious?" "I want the sale to start the fund," Keanu said. "No red carpets, no celebrity endorsements. Just one bike, one sale, one step toward something better." Jack shook his head, chuckling. "You're not who I thought you were." Keanu looked over, brow raised. "And who did you think I was?" Jack grinned. "Some Hollywood actor with good manners and a nice camera." They laughed softly. The tension in the car melted. As they reached the city, Keanu turned and said, "When we land in LA, I'm going to call a friend in Geneva. He knows the auction world. Quiet, efficient, no headlines." Jack reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a worn photograph of a young Vietnamese girl from 1971. Her small hand wrapped around a GI's fingers, a tin of candy between them. "I never mailed this photo," Jack said, "but I think it was meant for now." Keanu took the photo gently, looked at the eyes of the child in it, then whispered, "Then we send it now, in a new way." The car turned toward the airport. Neither man looked back. Los Angeles welcomed him with its usual buzz, camera flashes, traffic hum, and rehearsed questions tossed at red carpets. But Keanu Reeves moved through it all like a man underwater. His interviews felt thinner, his smiles quieter. Even as directors pitched scripts and studios pressed for commitments, his mind wandered back to that narrow hallway lined with children's faces. The faces on the wall, the flower in his journal, the soft voice that said, "Thank you." He returned to his modest home tucked in the hills, where the city lights blinked in the distance. Every night, after the noise faded, he sat alone at his desk, staring at a folded map of Vietnam. A red mark traced the route from Hoi An to Quang Tri. A tiny dot circled the orphanage compound. He didn't write in his journal yet, he wasn't ready. But he placed the wooden bead Sister Lian had given him in the center of the map, like a compass that didn't point north. One morning, instead of going to the studio, Keanu walked into a small Vietnamese-American cultural center on the east side of LA. No press, no entourage, just quiet curiosity. He asked for literature on Agent Orange relief efforts. He listened to stories. He donated without giving a name. He visited a second nonprofit the next day, this one run by Vietnamese American veterans and their children. They showed him photos of outreach programs, schools built on cleared land, mobile clinics in rural areas. Keanu nodded gently, asked few questions, and stayed far longer than expected. Before he left, one of the staff members said, "Most people forget, but if you've seen it, it doesn't let you go." That night, back at home, he stood in his garage. The motorcycle sat covered in a corner. An old Ducati Monster, the one he had ridden solo across the American Southwest during a moment of heartbreak nearly 2 decades ago. It was his escape then. Now it was something else. He ran his hand over the leather seat, stared at the dented gas tank, and made a decision. By morning, it was gone. He called Jack from the porch. The phone rang 3 times before the old soldier answered. "Jack," Keanu said softly, "I'm starting something." "What kind of something?" Jack asked. Keanu looked out toward the dawn. "Something without my name. But it needs your voice." There was a long pause on the other end of the line. Then Jack sighed. "I wondered when you'd call." Keanu didn't need to explain. Jack already understood. The silence between them was the kind of silence forged in places where truth walks barefoot and memory stings. Jack hadn't stopped thinking about Ha-Mai either, or the rows of names on the wall that he couldn't look at for more than a second. "I sold the bike," Keanu said simply. "The Ducati?" Jack asked, his voice catching slightly. "The Ducati?" "Yeah. I remember when you got it. You said it was the one thing you wouldn't give up." "I meant it then," Keanu replied. "But I hadn't walked through that hallway yet." Jack chuckled low in his throat, but it wasn't humor. "You want help organizing the fund?" "I want help giving it away the right way," Keanu said. "I want the right people to get it, quietly, no press, no spotlight, just impact." Jack's breath caught, but he didn't speak for a moment. Finally, he said, "I know some folks, old friends, quiet ones, people who've been doing this work in the shadows for years. That's exactly who I'm looking for. And what'll we call this thing if your name's not on it?" Keanu looked down at his journal, where the faded paper flower from Ha-Mai rested. The edges had browned slightly. He touched it gently, then said, "Start it under a new name, something rooted in memory. Call it the Quiet Foundation." Jack nodded on the other end, as if Keanu could see him. "That works. And it's fitting." The next week moved quickly. Keanu pulled out of a scheduled movie promotion tour, citing a personal project. He turned down an award show appearance. His team knew not to press when he said he needed the space. Instead, he poured time into back-channel meetings with attorneys, accountants, and 2 nonprofits in LA who agreed to serve as local partners. The fund would start small, just the proceeds from the Ducati, an anonymous donation from a private account. But it would grow. He knew it. Because sometimes momentum doesn't come from speeches, it comes from a photograph. A girl in a wheelchair, a hallway of unclaimed names, and the moment when you realize the only thing louder than history is the sound of children still living in its shadow. Keanu didn't tell anyone. He didn't post about it, but he slept better that night. That weekend, Keanu attended a charity event in Beverly Hills, one he'd committed to long before the Vietnam trip. Cameras flashed as he arrived in a modest black suit. Reporters shouted questions about his latest film, his next role, and the motorcycle he no longer owned. He smiled softly, nodded, but offered few words. Only one reporter asked something different. "Mr. Reeves, we heard you recently visited Vietnam. Was it for a role?" Keanu paused. He could have said yes, could have changed the subject. Instead, he offered the truth, but only a sliver of it. "No," he said, "it was for me." And with that, he walked inside. Later that evening, during the silent auction, Keanu stood alone by the window. He wasn't bidding. He wasn't networking. He watched the city glow beneath him, a sprawling grid of ambition and distraction. He reached into his pocket and touched the wooden bead Sister Lean had given him. Its edges were smooth now, worn. That night, after the event, he returned home and unpacked a small box he'd shipped from Hanoi. Inside were 2 photographs, a journal, and a small envelope containing a letter, written in pencil on delicate paper. The child's handwriting had faded, but the words had not. "Please tell them we are still here." He read it again, slowly, aloud. Then he opened his laptop and began typing. Not a script, not a speech. Has never been published. He outlined a plan for the Quiet Foundation, its mission to provide sustained funding to centers in Southeast Asia caring for victims of war dioxin exposure. The funds would go directly to grassroots medical clinics, orphanages, prosthetic workshops, and educational programs. No media campaign, no celebrity gala, just quiet, long-term support. He listed 3 names at the top of the board of advisors. 1. Jack Delaney. 2. Sister Lean. 3. Unknown gauge. 4. For a future Vietnamese director to be selected by the local communities themselves. He saved the document and stared at the screen for a long moment. Outside, Los Angeles buzzed with movement. But in his home, all was still. A soft breeze passed through the slightly open window. It carried the faintest scent of jasmine, just like the air in the garden behind the orphanage. And Keanu whispered to himself, "It's not about fixing the past. It's about honoring what it left behind." Then he closed the laptop. Tomorrow, he would begin. The office space they rented was small, tucked above a Vietnamese cafe in a quiet part of Los Angeles. No signs, no headlines, just a desk, a shared laptop, and a whiteboard with notes scribbled in 3 languages. It had been a month since Keanu returned from Vietnam, but every morning he woke up with the same image. Ha Mai, her paper flower pressed between fragile fingers, whispering, "Thank you." That memory didn't fade, it etched itself into his mind like film left too long in the light. Jack arrived before Keanu most days, carrying old folders and loose papers. He wasn't tech-savvy, but he wrote with clarity, sometimes ferocity. When Keanu stepped in that morning, Jack was hunched over his notebook, scrawling what would become the heart of their mission. He looked up, his voice gravelly but sure. "This isn't about guilt," he read aloud. "It's about responsibility. Responsibility to face what we left behind, and what still lives on." Keanu nodded. That's the mission statement. They named the initiative Project Remain, not because the pain remained, though it did, but because dignity, memory, and the right to be seen also remained. They wanted the world to see those faces, not as relics of war, but as people still fighting to live. Keanu wired the first anonymous donation that afternoon, a 6-figure gift from an undisclosed source. He made sure it was untraceable. No press releases, no red carpets, just a quiet transfer into a joint fund managed by 2 Vietnamese-led clinics near Hue and Quang Tri. The doctors there had seen what most tried to forget. They knew what every dollar could do. Their web developer, a soft-spoken graduate student named Min, asked once why Keanu didn't want his name on it. Keanu smiled gently. "Because it's not about me. And if it ever becomes about me, we've already failed." By evening, the website went live. It was stark. 1 photograph, a child's hand gripping a spoon. No faces, just the words, "They remain," and a simple button. Help. They didn't plan a launch event. They didn't call a single journalist, but the ripples began anyway. Within 48 hours, a small Reddit thread sparked global curiosity. Someone traced the campaign to Vietnam. A Berlin-based reporter reached out to the clinic. Donations began to appear, tiny at first, then larger. A retired Navy nurse contributed her entire pension. A group of high school students in Boston organized a fundraiser. The world, slowly, had begun to whisper. By the end of the second week, the whispers turned into voices. Project Remain had no celebrity endorsements, no public relations team, and no social media presence. Yet the donations tripled. A Vietnamese-American chef in San Jose offered proceeds from his weekend specials. A former Marine from Iowa wrote a check with a note that simply read, "For the girl with the flower." And a retired French ambassador sent in a wire transfer with a hand-typed letter saying he remembered the smell of defoliants on the wind in 1972 and never stopped hearing the silence that followed. Jack was stunned. "We didn't even ask," he muttered, flipping through printouts of contributions that kept growing. "People just knew." Keanu barely spoke during those updates. He simply sat, his fingers folded under his chin, watching the movement build like a tide. At night, he'd return home, open his journal, and press his thumb to the page where Ha-Mai's flower now rested between two thin layers of parchment. That image guided every decision. It reminded him why silence could be louder than any speech. A week later, one of the clinics sent over their first detailed report. It was handwritten, translated by one of the nurses. It read like a story. A boy named Bao, who hadn't spoken in 2 years, had begun humming after occupational therapy restarted. A girl who couldn't sit upright without pain now stood on her own, thanks to a modified wheelchair ordered with Project Remain funds. Another child was finally diagnosed properly, after years of mislabeling. The funds had allowed them to hire a specialist to fly in for 1 week. Keanu read each line twice, then whispered, "This is the only role that matters now." But the peace didn't last. On the third Monday, the donations were briefly frozen by a third-party payment processor who suspected the campaign was a scam, because it had no face. Min called in a panic. Jack swore loudly, his veteran instincts flaring up. But Keanu just leaned over the laptop, typed a calm message to the processor, and said, "Let them look. We're not hiding anything." By morning, the account was unfrozen. An anonymous letter from a prominent legal figure had apparently been sent to the company, confirming the authenticity of the campaign and praising its transparency. The donor? Unknown. But Jack had a hunch. Stared in shock. Someone watching. Someone who believed it too. And that was how Project Remain survived. Not because it shouted, but because it endured. The momentum kept building, and yet Keanu refused every request to go public. A journalist from a major magazine reached out through a nonprofit intermediary, asking for an interview about the anonymous force behind Project Remain. Keanu read the message and softly shook his head. "This story doesn't belong to me," he said. "It belongs to the people still living it." Instead, he sent back a single quote to be published without attribution. "If justice needs a face, let it be the children's." Jack, meanwhile, became the quiet voice guiding the mission. He handled logistics, reviewed medical supply orders, and helped write letters of thanks to rural Vietnamese doctors working with barely any equipment. One night, he stayed up writing an update for the site. The message was simple. "You may not know our names, that's the point. The names that matter are on the walls of those clinics." It struck a chord. The update was shared thousands of times. Without a single photo of Keanu or Jack, Project Remain became one of the fastest-growing anonymous humanitarian campaigns of the year. Volunteers came next. A group of Vietnamese American high school students in Houston created a translated awareness guide. A nurse from the Philippines flew to Da Nang to volunteer 2 weeks at a partner clinic. A former tech engineer in Chicago donated an encrypted communication platform to keep the campaign's donors and workers safe. And someone, still unknown, paid to replace a water purification system at the orphanage where Ha-Mai lived. One day, Min sent a video. It was short, just 30 seconds. In it, Ha-Mai sat in her wheelchair, gently holding a new book in her lap. A volunteer beside her asked, "What would you say to the people who helped?" Ha-Mai smiled and said in Vietnamese, "Tell them thank you, and tell them we remember their kindness, even if we don't know their names." Jack watched the video 3 times. When he turned to Keanu, his voice cracked. "We started this because we couldn't sleep, but they're dreaming again." Keanu didn't reply. He simply closed his laptop, took out the small wooden bead Sister Lean had given him and placed it beside his keyboard. Then he looked out the window where the city lights glowed, distant and impersonal, and said, "Let's keep it going." And quietly, without cameras, applause, or headlines, they did. It started with a photo, a grainy snapshot posted by a Vietnamese teenager named Lin, who had volunteered at the orphanage during a summer service project. The image was simple. Children gathered around a newly delivered shipment of medical supplies, smiling beside a banner that read, "From Friends Who Remember." No logos, no celebrity names, just joy. But the caption ignited something. These gifts came from a group called Project Remain. They don't ask for thanks, but they remember us. Within hours, her post had been reshared by dozens of classmates, then hundreds of others. Vietnamese university students from Hanoi to Ho Chi Minh City began amplifying the message, each adding their own voice. We are not forgotten. The story caught the attention of a small human rights blog based in Australia. Curious, the writer traced the Project Remain domain registration. Anonymous. But a few breadcrumbs suggested something deeper. A grant listed in partnership with a known Vietnamese American clinic in California. A mysterious donor who had previously funded healthcare initiatives in silence. By the weekend, the story had gone global. Veterans from the United States began posting comments under the article. "I served in Quang Tri. I've carried guilt my whole life. Thank you for doing what I couldn't." Others simply donated, often in small amounts, with notes like, "For the ones I left behind." The ripple effect grew fast and wide. Former war reporters, some long retired, others still active, began sharing their memories. One posted a black and white photo of the exact orphanage Keanu had visited, taken in 1972, with the caption, "I never thought I'd see this place again, but hope has returned to where silence once lived." Soon, investigative journalists and media outlets dug deeper, trying to uncover who was behind Project Remain. They combed grant listings, interviewed clinic staff, and analyzed donor trails. What they kept finding were anonymous payments, private bank accounts not linked to any foundation names, and handwritten letters signed only "From those who still care." But it didn't take long before the dots quietly connected. A former Vietnamese nurse at a Los Angeles clinic gave a single quote to a local newspaper. He came in with no camera, no speech, no entourage, just questions and eyes full of grief. Within hours, a journalist from New York published a piece calling him a ghost donor with a movie star's heart. It went viral. Headlines popped up everywhere. Was Keanu Reeves behind the Quiet campaign for Agent Orange victims? Hollywood star's anonymous mission leaves Vietnam in tears. Not fame, just grace? Keanu offered no comment. But the internet didn't stop. Then, on a quiet Thursday afternoon, the Project Remain website was updated. A single sentence appeared under the mission statement. Unsigned. The ones who suffered shouldn't be the ones forgotten. A week later, a video began circulating on social media. It was filmed on a phone, shaky but tender. Ha Mai sat in her wheelchair beneath a mango tree, holding the same paper flower she'd given Keanu. Around her stood 10 children, some walking with braces, some leaning on each other, one holding up a handmade sign that read, "Thank you, ghost friend." A.M. Mai looked into the camera and said softly in Vietnamese, her voice translated by captions, "We don't know your name for sure, but we know your heart. Thank you for seeing us." She raised the flower and added, "This didn't fade like the war, but your kindness made it hurt less." The video exploded online. Millions watched. Comments poured in from every continent. Veterans from the US, Australia, and South Korea shared their memories and regrets. Young people who had never heard of Agent Orange began learning, sharing, donating. And Keanu? He watched the video in his kitchen, alone, the sound low. The flower Ha-mai gave him resting inside his journal on the table. He pressed pause when she smiled, then picked up a pen. He began writing a new letter, not for the public, not for the media, but for the next child who might ask, "Did the world forget us?" And his answer, already forming on the page, was clear: not anymore. The sky over Los Angeles was gray with early morning light as soft rain tapped the windows of a small chapel tucked behind an old church. Inside, only about 20 chairs were arranged in a quiet semicircle. A faded American flag was draped over a simple pine casket. On a table nearby sat a black and white photo of Jack Delaney in uniform. Young, bright-eyed, full of hope, taken before the weight of war aged him from the inside out. There were no speeches, no music, no cameras. That was how Jack wanted it. Just a handful of people he trusted. Old war buddies, a nurse who had helped him in his final months, a quiet woman from the VA hospital who'd known him for years, and Keanu. He sat toward the back in a plain black blazer, his shoulders curved slightly forward. His hands were folded tightly in his lap. He hadn't spoken since arriving. He didn't need to. After a few minutes of silence, an elderly man with liver-spotted hands and a worn Marine Corps pin on his collar stepped to the front. He unfolded a piece of paper slowly, as though it might tear just from the weight of what was written inside. "This," he said gently, "is a letter Jack asked me to read if he passed before he could say it himself." The room fell silent again. "To Keanu," the man read, his voice gravelly but steady. "You didn't just walk beside me in Vietnam. You walked with me through memories I had buried for decades. You saw what I couldn't explain. You sat with pain I couldn't name, and you never once looked away." Keanu's eyes lowered, his jaw tensed. The letter continued, "You didn't come to rescue, you came to remember, and in doing that you helped me remember who I was before the silence." A breath caught in Keanu's throat, but he didn't move. "You reminded me," the letter read on, "that redemption isn't loud or bright. Sometimes it's quiet. Sometimes it's sitting still while the world keeps turning. You didn't just remember the children, you remembered me too." A tear rolled down Keanu's cheek as the final sentence echoed through the stillness. The man reading folded the letter carefully, held it to his chest for a beat, then returned to his seat without a word. No one clapped. No one needed to. The silence that followed felt like a deeper kind of reverence, one stitched together by memory, regret, and a quiet kind of grace. Keanu remained in his chair, unmoving. Only his eyes shifted slightly as they settled on the photo of Jack. The image seemed different now. No longer just a soldier, but a man who had faced the echo of war and chose, in his final days, to answer it with compassion. After the small gathering dispersed, Keanu stayed behind. A chapel attendant came to gather the flowers, but paused when he saw Keanu alone in the front pew. The man quietly stepped away. Keanu reached into his coat pocket and took out a folded piece of paper. Not a speech, not notes. Just something he'd written the night before when the words refused to let him sleep. He walked to the front, stood beside Jack's casket, and placed the paper on top. Then he finally spoke, his voice low, roughened by grief, but firm. "You gave more than a uniform, Jack," he said. "You gave the truth, and when the truth became too hard to carry alone, you handed me part of it and trusted I wouldn't drop it." He paused, swallowing the rising tide in his throat. "I don't know if I deserved that trust, but I'll honor it, I promise." No one recorded it. No press stood by. But for those few in the chapel, the moment felt etched in something far more permanent than video. A man known around the world had just given the most important eulogy of his life, and hadn't raised his voice once. Outside, the clouds had begun to break. Sunlight filtered through slowly, catching the raindrops still clinging to the window panes. Keanu walked out into it alone, holding nothing in his hands but the wooden bead Sister Lean had given him. And as the chapel door closed behind him, he looked up at the sky and whispered, "I'm going back." 2 weeks later, Keanu Reeves stepped off a modest flight at Noi Bai International Airport in Hanoi. No entourage, no announcements, just a small black backpack over one shoulder and Jack's final letter tucked safely inside his jacket pocket. He moved through customs unnoticed, just another quiet traveler in a sea of stories. Outside, a driver from the center waited, holding a handmade cardboard sign that simply read, "Friend." Keanu nodded and got in without a word. The drive south took hours, past stretches of open country, small villages, and the winding shadow of rivers that had long outlived the men who once marched beside them. Keanu looked out the window the entire time, not journaling now, not recording, just watching, absorbing. At the orphanage, the staff was surprised but not shocked. Sister Lean met him at the gate, her expression both warm and somber. "You came back," she said. "I had to," he replied, handing her the envelope Jack had left. "He wanted you to have this." Inside the envelope was a photo of Jack from 1971, standing beside a Vietnamese boy holding a candy bar. On the back, in Jack's handwriting, "I never forgot your face. I hope you had a full life." Sister Lean placed the photo in the center's memory wall, beneath the heading, "Those Who Return." Keanu spent the evening sitting beside Ha Mai again. Her hands were stronger now. She could hold the crayon herself. She drew a picture of a tall man planting a tree. As dusk settled, Keanu walked to the far edge of the courtyard. With the help of a young volunteer, he placed a small sapling into the earth. No plaque, no name. He whispered, "For Jack," and pressed the soil in with his own hands. That night, under a sky flickering with quiet stars, Keanu stood outside the guest room and looked out over the land that had changed his heart forever. And as the wind passed through the trees, brushing gently against the orphanage walls, it almost sounded like the echo of Jack's voice. "You didn't just remember them, you remembered me too." The sky above Quang Tri hung low and gray as Keanu Reeves stepped quietly through the orphanage gates. It had been months since he last stood here. Months since Jack's laughter echoed down the courtyard paths. Since Ha Mai had handed him a paper flower that changed his world. But today, something was different. A garden, small but vibrant, had taken root beside the main walkway. Rows of herbs, vegetables, and bright yellow daisies lined the soft-tilled soil, tended lovingly by the children who once only knew sorrow. Keanu paused at the edge, shoes crunching gently on gravel. A modest wooden plaque stood at the garden's heart. Carved carefully in 2 languages, it read, "In memory of Jack Delaney, friend, veteran, peacemaker." Keanu's hand hovered over the plaque, then rested on the warm wood. No crowd stood with him. No press. Just quiet air, rich earth, and the scent of lemongrass rising from the soil. Mai rolled toward him in her chair, her cheeks glowing with energy. "We planted it after he passed," she said in careful English. "Everyone helped." She pointed toward a slender tree near the corner. "That one's his. Frangipani, it smells nice." Keanu knelt, running his fingers through the dirt. "It's beautiful," he said, voice low. He would have smiled. The girl looked at him seriously. "Did he get peace?" Keanu looked up at the sky, then back at the plaque, remembering Jack's final words and the unshakable look in his eyes before they said goodbye. "I think," Keanu said, nodding slowly, "he left it behind." They sat in silence for a moment, side by side, facing the small garden that now grew where grief once stood. Then, Ha Mai handed him a trowel. "Come," she said, pointing to an empty patch of soil. "Let's plant something for the others." Keanu took the tool, pressed his hands into the ground beside hers, and began to dig. The dirt was warm, forgiving, and alive. Just like the legacy Jack left in the hands of children who knew how to nurture hope. It was the beginning of something neither of them would forget. They worked in silence for a while, Keanu and Hamai, as the wind stirred the tall grass beyond the fence. Other children began to gather, watching with curiosity. One little boy with braces on his legs shuffled over and asked if he could help. Hamai nodded, handing him a tiny seedling with a wide grin. Soon, it was no longer just 2 planting. It was 10, then 15. The garden became a shared rhythm of hands in the soil, laughter mixing with bird song, and moments of quiet reverence as each seedling was placed with care. Keanu watched it unfold like a scene written by life itself, a living tribute not just to Jack, but to resilience. A volunteer nurse approached with a watering can and offered it to Keanu. He tilted it gently over the soil where the frangipani tree stood, letting the water trickle over the roots. "He used to tell me," he said softly, mostly to himself, "that healing doesn't always look like justice. Sometimes it looks like growth." Sister Lean stepped out onto the porch, her hands folded, her smile gentle. "We told the children about Jack's letter," she said. "They asked if we could turn his words into something that stays." She gestured toward a small wooden bench beneath the tree. Etched into the backrest were the words, "Healing takes root where compassion is planted." Keanu sat there, briefly, resting as the kids continued tending to the garden. Hamai sat beside him, swinging her legs slightly and glancing at his notebook, which peeked out from his canvas bag. "Did you write about us?" she asked. Keanu hesitated, then pulled the notebook into his lap. "I did," he said, flipping through sketches, notes, bits of taped leaves, and the faded paper flower she had given him months ago. "But I didn't know what to say until now." She smiled. "Maybe you just say what you see." He nodded and began writing, the pen moving slowly, deliberately. Around him, life stirred. Children laughing, sun shifting through branches, and seeds taking hold of the earth. The past didn't vanish, but it softened. In that moment, the garden became more than a memory. It became a promise. As the afternoon waned, the last of the saplings was tucked into the warm earth. Keanu stood, brushing soil from his hands, and looked out over the rows of budding green. Each small plant marked a life remembered, a wound honored, and a future sown in quiet hope. He felt the weight of Jack's absence, but also something new, an undercurrent of peace that hummed softly beneath the sorrow. The children gathered around the plaque. Hamai read it aloud in her careful English. "In memory of Jack Delaney, friend, veteran, peacemaker." A hush fell, respectful and full of things not easily said. One of the older boys placed a drawing beneath the plaque. 3 stick figures holding hands under a tree. Above them, in bold letters, it read, "You came back." Keanu closed his eyes for a moment. The breeze tugged gently at his sleeves, as if the world itself were exhaling. He turned to Hamai and asked, "Would you show me how you take care of this place?" She grinned, wheeling herself forward. "We sing to the seeds sometimes, and we water them with stories." Keanu laughed, a genuine, easy sound. "Then I've got a few stories to share." As the sun began to lower over the trees, casting long, amber shadows, Keanu knelt once more beside her. She handed him a seed, and together they planted it in the soil. He patted the earth, not to bury something, but to cradle it. "Do you think the world will change?" she asked suddenly, her voice softer than the wind. He looked at her, then at the soil-streaked hands of children, at the broken but joyful faces that had become his quiet teachers. "I think it already has," he said. "Right here." They stayed until the sky turned pink and gold. until the shadows stretched long and the laughter turned to yawns, until the garden, though new, felt ancient, like it had always been waiting for them. Keanu stood, kissed Hamai gently on the head, and whispered, "Thank you for helping me remember." And as he walked away from the garden, his footsteps light and steady, the seeds behind him began their silent climb toward the light. Keanu sat on the plane ride home with his journal open in his lap. The cabin was dim, the soft hum of the engines creating a strange kind of silence that let thoughts come without resistance. He stared at the blank page for a long time before finally writing. The words meant to be curt. He felt more than sympathy. They say time heals all wounds, but some wounds need witnesses. We don't heal alone. He paused, staring at those words. A memory flickered. Hamai's voice, Jack's last smile, the paper flower pressed into his notebook. This trip had not been about discovery. It had been about returning to something the world had tried to forget. When he landed in Los Angeles, everything felt louder. The streetlights, the conversations, the requests. But inside him, something had grown quieter, calmer. He wasn't the same man who had boarded the flight weeks ago with just a notebook and a camera. He had brought pieces of something heavier home with him. Stories, faces, names etched into a wall. Instead of calling his agent back, he drove straight to the foundation office. No press release, no cameras. Just a handwritten note slipped to his staff. Let's expand. Project remain. Later that night, Keanu walked through his garden. He knelt beside the small plot where he'd planted Vietnamese mint years ago after his first trip to Southeast Asia. Now, he placed a small wooden bead next to it, the one Sister Lean had given him. It wasn't just a reminder, it was a vow. He whispered into the evening air, "You were never forgotten." A few days later, sitting quietly in the corner of a Vietnamese-American community center, Keanu watched as young volunteers organized supplies to send abroad. One girl read the mission aloud from a printout. Project Remain is a commitment not of guilt, but of love, of memory, of action. Keanu said nothing, but inside he knew. The real change didn't come from one visit, it came from the promise to return, not just in person, but in purpose. He looked down at his journal again, flipping to the final page. He wrote just one sentence. "I think Jack left peace behind, and maybe that's how it spreads." Weeks later, a package arrived at the orphanage in Vietnam. It was simple, brown paper, no sender listed, but inside were sketchbooks, solar lights, new wheelchairs, medical supplies, and a printed photo. It showed Keanu standing beside Jack in the courtyard, arms crossed, quiet smiles on their faces. Tucked in with it was a note written in Vietnamese and English, "From those who remember." Sister Lean held the photograph for a long time before hanging it on the hallway wall, just beside the garden plaque bearing Jack's name. Hamai came by and stared at it. She traced the edge of the frame with her fingers, then looked up at Sister Lean. "I kept his promise," she said. That weekend, the children painted new signs for the garden. Hamai painted hers in bright pink. "Thank you for seeing us." When asked who she was writing it to, she simply said, "Anyone who's been afraid to look." Back in the US, a journalist finally caught up to Keanu during a brief film shoot and asked why he stayed anonymous for the project. His answer was soft but resolute. "Because this wasn't about recognition," he said. "It was about remembrance." He left the interview early and walked to a quiet park. Sitting beneath a tree, he pulled out his journal again. For a long time, he wrote nothing, just listened. The wind moved through the branches like a breath. A child nearby laughed. Then he turned to a fresh page and began to draft something new. Not a screenplay, not a campaign memo, just a reflection, his way of keeping the story alive. Voiceover. Sometimes the greatest legacy isn't carved in marble. It's written in memory. And memory is made not by what we keep, but by what we choose to carry. On screen, have you ever witnessed injustice and felt helpless? Share your story in the comments. And what mission should Keanu take on next? Subscribe to follow every act of kindness. The screen fades to black. Only one line remains, handwritten in soft white ink. We don't heal alone.